No one rides the last train at night thinking anything could go wrong. But sometimes when the station is silent and the rails hum with a ghostly vibration, you realize that the last train isn't just a ride home, it's a passage into something you may never return from. The last train. Ethan Clarke had missed the earlier train by just minutes, the one he usually took after his late shift at the factory. The platform was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights flickering, casting weak pools of illumination on cracked tiles. He checked the schedule board. The last train would arrive in 20 minutes. Normally, he wouldn't have minded the wait, but tonight there was a strange tension in the air, as if the station itself were holding its breath. The first passengers arrived silently. A middle-aged man in a long coat, a young woman clutching a small backpack, and an older woman who seemed to glance over her shoulder repeatedly, though the platform was otherwise empty. Ethan took a seat on the cold metal bench, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. The air smelled faintly of rust and damp wood, and the distant clatter of the rails felt louder than it should, echoing unnaturally through the station. When the train finally arrived, it glided in with a metallic screech that sent a shiver down his spine. The cars were dimly lit, the seats empty, the air thick with a stale industrial odour. Ethan stepped inside, noticing that the other passengers had scattered quietly through the cars. He chose a seat in the middle of the train, keeping the older woman within sight. She didn't acknowledge him, but her eyes were wide, glinting with something like fear. The doors hissed closed, and the train began its slow departure from the station. Outside, the platform disappeared into darkness, and the city lights faded into a blur. Ethan tried to focus on his phone, but it refused to work. No signal, no notifications, nothing but the dim screen and his own increasingly nervous heartbeat. It began subtly. A rhythmic tapping, soft at first, echoing somewhere at the rear of the train. Ethan dismissed it as the train adjusting to the rails, but the tapping grew louder, deliberate, almost like footsteps. He glanced around, but no one moved. The middle-aged man had vanished from sight. The young woman stared blankly out the window, and the older woman was gone. Ethan's stomach churned as he realized that the train was far emptier than it had been when he boarded. The lights flickered, plunging the car into near darkness before returning to their dim glow. Ethan noticed reflections in the windows, figures standing behind him, just beyond the angle of his vision, disappearing whenever he turned his head. The tapping continued, sometimes closer, sometimes receding, always accompanied by a faint hum, as if the train itself were breathing. Panic began to rise in Ethan's chest. He stood, moving cautiously toward the next car. The passageway stretched unnaturally, the train seeming longer than it should, the lights flickering in uneven patterns. In the corner of his eye, he glimpsed shadows that didn't belong to any passengers. Doors that should have led to empty cars now opened into voids of darkness. The hum of the rails grew louder, echoing inside the train like a chant. Ethan entered another car and froze. The seats were filled with indistinct figures, faces blurred and pale, staring at him with empty eyes. Some leaned forward slightly, their mouths moving silently, as if speaking, but no sound reached his ears. A cold breeze swept through the car, carrying whispers that seemed almost coherent. "You shouldn't be here. The last train remembers. It always remembers." His breath quickened. The tapping was now relentless, coming from the rear. Ethan turned, trying to escape back to the first car, but the train shifted unnaturally, accelerating far faster than before. The city outside vanished entirely. Through the windows there was only darkness, stretching endlessly in both directions. He realized with a cold clarity that this train was no longer bound by normal tracks. The older woman appeared suddenly beside him, her eyes wide, pleading. "Don't look back," she whispered, voice barely audible over the hum. "It follows those who watch too long." Before he could respond, The lights flickered violently, plunging him into darkness. In the pitch black, the shadows moved closer, cold hands brushing against his shoulders, faces pressing into his mind. Ethan stumbled forward, heart racing, every sense screaming to escape. When the lights returned, he was alone. The seats were empty, the taps gone, but a faint mist hovered low in the car. The train seemed endless, stretching forward into an inky blackness. The older woman, the man, the young woman, none of them existed. Only the faint echo of whispers lingered, faint and mocking. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Time lost meaning. Ethan wandered through car after car, each identical to the last, all empty, all silent. The windows reflected his own pale, frightened face, but in the reflections his eyes looked older, sunken, haunted by a fear he couldn't name. The tapping returned, soft at first, growing again, always coming from behind him. Eventually, he reached the last car. The doors opened into nothingness. No city, no platform, no exit, just darkness. He stepped forward cautiously, and the door slammed shut behind him. Panic consumed him. The hum of the train rose to a deafening roar, and shadows poured from every corner, faces pressed against him, whispering unintelligible threats. Ethan ran, blindly, until he tripped and fell onto the cold floor. The train shuddered violently, lights flickering. Through the windows, he glimpsed the platform he had left hours ago, the city lights dim and distorted. He lunged toward the door, but it vanished, leaving only wall. The last train had claimed him. When the morning shift arrived at the station, the platform was empty. Ethan Clarke's bag sat neatly on the bench. His phone lay next to it, screen cracked, displaying the time of the last train's departure. No trace of him remained. The announcement system crackled faintly. The last train will depart in 20 minutes. Please mind the gap. And somewhere in the tunnels, a soft tapping echoed, waiting for the next passenger who would miss their usual ride. Like, subscribe, share, and click that bell icon. Midnight Express. Samantha Blake had always relied on the 11:15 p.m. express to get home from her night shift at the hospital. That night, she was running late. The city streets were slick from a sudden drizzle, reflections of streetlights shimmering in the puddles. When she arrived at the station, the 11:15 had already pulled away, leaving only the distant echo of metal wheels on rails. She glanced at the schedule board. There was still the last train at 11:45, but the delay filled her with unease. Something about the station seemed wrong. The platform was nearly empty. A lone janitor pushed a mop bucket across cracked tiles, and a few commuters lingered silently, faces pale and expressionless. Samantha shivered as she moved toward the waiting area. The lights overhead flickered, buzzing faintly. A chill ran through the air, as if the station itself were holding its breath. She tried to tell herself she was imagining it. When the last train finally arrived, it hissed and screeched in a way that made Samantha pause. The car doors opened slowly, revealing dim interiors. Only a handful of passengers entered. An elderly man with a cane, a teenager with headphones, and a young woman who seemed to stare at nothing in particular, lips moving as if whispering silently. Samantha climbed aboard, choosing a seat near the middle. The doors closed behind her with a final, sharp hiss. The train began to move, but something was immediately off. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks sounded irregular, a hollow echo reverberating through the empty cars. Samantha glanced around, noticing that the other passengers were unusually still, unnervingly quiet. When she looked out the window, the familiar cityscape dissolved into darkness. The streetlights and buildings were gone, replaced by dense fog and shadowed shapes that seemed to drift alongside the train. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. Samantha felt the hum of the train beneath her as if it were alive, pulsing with some unknown energy. Then she heard it. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, coming from the car behind her. She turned, but no one was there. Her breath quickened. She stood, moving carefully toward the next car. The corridor seemed impossibly long, stretching further than the train should. Flickering lights cast distorted shadows that leapt across walls and seats. In the next car, the air grew colder. Samantha could see her breath forming mist as she walked. The seats were occupied, figures slouched, staring at her, faces blurred, pale, some with mouths opening and closing, whispering words she couldn't hear. She wanted to turn and leave, but the door behind her vanished. She realized with a sudden jolt that the train was no longer normal. The outside darkness had no end, no lights, no familiar markers. A sudden tapping started, soft at first, then louder, echoing from the rear. Samantha's heart pounded as she quickened her pace toward the sound. She passed more figures, some half visible through the fog inside the cars, others only glimpses in the shadows. The young woman from the first car appeared suddenly, standing in the aisle, eyes wide, hands raised as if to warn her. "Don't look back," she whispered, voice barely audible over the hum of the rails. Samantha obeyed instinctively, pressing forward, but the corridor seemed to twist, elongate unnaturally, trapping her. The tapping grew relentless, following her with each step. She stumbled into a car that seemed empty, the seats worn and torn, the walls damp. Shadows moved along the ceiling, fleeting and impossible. The train pulsed beneath her feet, vibrating like a heartbeat, the sound of wheels on rails now a deafening hum. She realized that time had lost meaning. Hours could have passed, or mere seconds. She had no way of knowing. Suddenly she felt a cold presence behind her. Samantha froze, heart hammering. A shadow swept across the floor, and she heard a soft whisper. "The last train remembers those who watch." She spun, but the corridor behind her was gone. She was alone. Or so she thought. The figures returned, standing at the edges of her vision, faces pale, mouths moving silently, stretching along the train that seemed to have no end. In a panic, Samantha ran, following the corridor forward, doors appearing and disappearing. She passed the elderly man and the teenager from earlier, both frozen in place, heads tilted unnaturally. The train car she entered next was darker, the air thick with mist. Tapping resumed, louder now, like someone, or something, was racing behind her. Shadows pressed close, brushing against her, whispering unintelligible words that chilled her to the bone. Finally, she stumbled into the last car. The doors opened into nothingness. No station, no city, no exit. Just a black void. Samantha backed away, realizing she could go no further. The tapping became deafening, the shadows closing in, pressing against her from all sides. The faint hum of the train reached a crescendo, vibrating inside her skull. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The shadows vanished. The mist dissipated, and the train was empty once more. Samantha collapsed into a seat, shaking, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She dared to look out the windows. Outside, the city appeared, familiar lights, streets, and platforms. The last train had returned her, but she knew it wasn't over. The whispers lingered in her mind, the taps echoing in her memory, and she understood that some rides never truly end. When the morning commuters arrived, the platform was empty except for her bag neatly placed on a bench. Samantha was nowhere to be found, though the ticket machine still printed receipts for the last train at 11:45 p.m. Somewhere beneath the rails, deep in the tunnels, the faint tapping echoed, waiting for the next passenger who would miss their usual ride. Like, subscribe, share, and click that bell icon. The shadow line. David Mercer had always been punctual, but tonight he was late. The city streets were slick with rain, reflections of neon signs shimmering in puddles. He sprinted through the empty station corridors, breath sharp, muscles aching. The schedule board read 11:50 p.m. for the last train, but the digital display flickered strangely, as if uncertain. The platform was silent, almost too quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound. A few other late-night passengers waited. A man in a dark trench coat, a teenage girl clutching a small duffel, and an older woman whose eyes darted constantly toward the tracks. David took a seat on a metal bench, feeling the cold seep through his clothes. The air smelled of damp metal and stale air, but beneath it was something different, something he couldn't identify. The lights flickered once more, and he shivered involuntarily. The last train arrived with a screech, metal wheels grinding against rails. The cars were dimly lit, interiors coated with shadows. David stepped aboard, noticing the other passengers already seated or silently standing. He chose a seat near the middle, keeping the older woman in view. The train hissed shut behind him, and immediately he felt a strange vibration beneath his feet, almost like a heartbeat. The train departed. City lights dissolved into darkness, replaced by a dense fog that pressed against the windows. David's phone had no signal. Nothing worked. He tried to focus on his surroundings, but the shadows seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Soft, deliberate tapping echoed from the back of the train. He assumed it was another passenger, but when he turned, the aisle was empty. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The air grew colder. David noticed reflections in the windows, figures standing behind him, pale faces that vanished when he turned. He felt the hairs on his neck rise. The teenage girl from earlier whispered to herself, lips moving soundlessly, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The older woman was gone. The tapping grew louder, closer. David stood, moving toward the next car, but the passage seemed unnaturally long, distorted. The train itself felt alive, pulsing beneath his feet. He reached another car which appeared empty at first, but then shadows began crawling along the walls, whispering just out of comprehension. Faces emerged from the darkened seats, blurred, pale, some screaming silently. Panic gripped him. David ran, the corridor stretching endlessly, cars repeating as if the train had multiplied. Doors appeared and disappeared. The figures followed, always at the edge of his vision. He felt cold hands brush against his arms and shoulders. The tapping was relentless, echoing like footsteps running behind him. The hum of the rails became a deafening chant in his ears. Finally, he entered the last car. The doors opened into pure darkness. No station, no city, no exit. The shadows swarmed, whispering, unintelligible words pressing closer. The train pulsed violently, lights flickering. David stumbled, almost losing consciousness. Then silence. The shadows receded. The mist lifted. He was alone, the train empty, yet the feeling of being followed lingered in every breath. David looked out the windows. The familiar city was visible again, the station lights shining faintly in the distance. But he knew he had changed. The train had marked him. Every step toward the platform felt heavy. When he finally reached the bench, his bag sat untouched, exactly where he had left it. He was back, but he would never be the same. The whispers, the taps, the shadows, they had travelled with him, lingering in his memory. By morning, commuters noticed his pale, exhausted figure sitting silently on the platform. The announcement system crackled faintly. "The last train will depart in 20 minutes. Please mind the gap." Somewhere deep in the tunnels beneath the city, the faint tapping continued, waiting for the next passenger to miss their usual ride.